Hi, this is Sue Glenn, and we're going to talk about island biogeography today. This is part of the chapter we've been talking about geographic ecology. In the book by Manuel Molles and Sher, Ecology Concepts and Applications, this is the chapter 21, the second part of that chapter. And we've already introduced the idea of geographic ecology and species area curves in the previous video. Wilson had been studying ants and looking at the impact of island area on the number of ant species, the species richness. And every 10-time increase in the size of an island resulted in the data he was seeing that there was doubling the number of ant species. So the number of species was dependent on the island size. He also noticed that the more isolated islands, the more distant islands had fewer species. So obviously the immigration of species onto an island, the rate of that immigration was going to be much lower on a more distant isolated island than on a closer island, meaning that there is immigration going on, that there is movement of species. He teamed with Robert MacArthur, and they published a theory on why this was happening that explained both the impacts of island size and isolation, and they called it the theory of island biogeography. They first proposed it in a double published paper, or two paper publication in the journal Ecology in 1963, and then went on to write a book, which was published by Princeton University Press in 1967. The theory of island biogeography actually explains how many species you predict to have in an area as a balance between how many new species are coming into the island and how many existing species on the island are disappearing, are becoming locally extinct. And so we're talking about immigration of a species, not of an individual, but immigration of a species that is not currently found on the island coming to the island. And if we look at this graph of the island biogeography theory graph, we can see the x-axis is the number of species present on that island. So how many species are actually there? So this would be your number of species, not your population size, but your number of species, or you could even consider that to be species richness on your island at a given time. And so let's say you have very few species, so you're down at the left side of this axis. The y-axis then is the rate of immigration or extinction. So it's the rate new species are coming or the extinction rate of species existing on the island. And so if we're over on the left side of this axis where there's very few species, then pretty much anything that flies onto the island or swims to the island or comes to the island is going to be a new species. So you'll have a very high rate of immigration. And remember, this is a rate, so this might be the number of species per year or the number of species per decade immigrating to that island. And so as you start to get more and more species on the island, so as your species richness starts to move right, starts to increase, then you just have fewer choices of fewer chances of the new individual arriving being a new species. And eventually you get to a point where this would be your total number of species that are in the region, and you get to a point where you can't have any new immigrating species. So when we're looking at immigration, it's going to decline as you gather more and more species. But that gets balanced by species extinction. And when we look at species extinction on as it's defined in island biogeography, we're talking about local extinction, which is extinction just in that island or in that location. So it's not globally going extinct, but it's being outcompeted by species on the island or being eaten by other species on the island, and it's not going to be able to be found the next time you come. And so species are always kind of coming and going. You've got new species coming in with this immigration, And then we have existing species on the island that you saw last time that are disappearing. And so we do find that extinction will actually increase as we get more and more species on the island. The extinction rate goes up. And the shapes of these curves are not terribly important at this point. What is important for you to pay attention to is that these curves cross. And at that point where these curves cross, it means the immigration rate equals the extinction rate. And you have a stable number of species. So that point where they cross is actually an equilibrium point, where when immigration equals extinction. So the number of species is not going up and the number of species is not going down. But the actual species from there are changing. You've still got species going extinct at this point, and you still have species that are immigrating at that point. So you've got both of the species coming and going, but the actual total number of species, read down off the x-axis there, and that's going to be your equilibrium number of species, where it's not going to go up and down at that point. I'm just going to take a little bit of time here to redraw that because I think it's a little bit confusing. So on the x-axis we have the number of species on our island. In this case we are looking at an individual island. So we're looking at one island, an individual island. And then on the x-axis, so the number of species across the y-axis is going to go from a low number to a high number. You've got the maximum would be the number in your region. And then on the x-axis, we're going to put the immigration rate. Actually, let me put that. I'm going to use the same colors as in your book. So we have the immigration rate in blue. So that could be the number of species per year. And we'll also put, I'll write it on the y-axis, we have the local extinction rate. We'll just make a second axis, but they're the same. Number of species per year. And that's going to go from low to high. They're the same axis. And low to high. So if we have very few species on our island, our immigration rates we know are going to be high because everything new coming to our island is a new species. Everything coming to the island is going to be a new species. If you already have all the species that are in the region on your island, then you're not going to have any new species coming, and you're going to have some sort of decline here. So we can make that a straight line, we can make that a curved line. For all intents and purposes at this point, it's not going to make a difference. And the same thing, we're going to see the number of extinctions. If you don't have very many species on the island, there's not very many to disappear. So your rate of species going extinct per year is going to be much lower, and then that's going to go up. Where those two lines cross, that is your equilibrium point. So that is your equilibrium between immigration and extinction, where immigration equals extinction. If we read down from that point right here, this would be where it crosses the x-axis, the number of species that you would have at equilibrium. So this is your equilibrium number of species. So the equilibrium number of species is not going to change once you're there because immigration and extinction are going to balance each other out. And so just remember that this is local extinction, extinction of species on an island. So why would you predict that extinction would rise with when you had more species on the island? And there's three different mechanisms proposed for that. One is just you have a greater probability of something disappearing from the island just because you have more species there. So you just have higher odds that something's going to happen. Um, as the number of species increases, you still have limited resources. And because you have limited resources, oops, limited resources, then the population size of each species, there's only so many morsels of food, so much energy available. So the population size of each species must diminish. And that increases just out of stochastic random occurrences. You could lose a species there. And as your number of species increases, you've got more competitive interactions then. You end up with fewer resources each, you've got more species competing for them, and so species will be outcompeted and disappear. So overall, this is going to reduce your species richness as you get more and more species. So if we look at the number of species on the island, and the local extinction rate is going to go up in some way for numerous factors then. So the point where those two lines crossed, so if we have the number of species and we have the rate of immigration and the rate of local extinction, and immigration goes down with the number of species and extinction goes up. That point where those two lines cross, that is your equilibrium number of species that will occur on that particular given island. But even though we've got island size here as being a major driving force, how does, the number of species being the major driving force, how does the island size impact that? So we do know that larger islands support more species, but we also know that islands that are closer to sources of immigrants will support more species as well. So how do those two things interact with each other? We talked about this data from McCarthy and Wilson's paper about the islands that were different distances away from New Guinea when we're talking about species area curves, and the fact that area is not the only determinant of how many species you have, but how isolated the islands were important as well. So on this graph, we have the x-axis is the area, the size of the island, and the number of bird species on the y-axis, both log scales. But then the different colors are showing you how far the islands are from New Guinea. And so if we take a look at isolation, then we think about isolation. The more isolated you have, you're going to be getting fewer individuals coming in, so you're going to have lower immigration. So if you increase isolation, you're going to decrease immigration of new species. So from island biogeography, and we have the axis for island biogeography where the number of species are on your x-axis. SPP means species, more than one species. And then on your y-axis, you're going to have the rate of immigration. So that's going to be the number of new species per year. And if we look at the islands that are nice and close, they'll have close to the source of species, they're going to have very high rates of immigration, and it'll drop off until they fill with all the species. The islands that are the red ones that are far away from sources of new species, it's going to have a much lower immigration rate. So it's going to be seeing fewer species arriving every year. And then the intermediate islands that are in blue is going to be somewhere in the middle. So here, if we're looking at it in terms of isolation, the green line at the top, those are near islands. The red ones at the bottom are far islands. And then the blue one in the middle, That is sort of like a middle distance island or an intermediate distance island. So if we know that immigration is going to change with how isolated the island is, then how does that affect the actual equilibrium number of species? Remember, counter to this, you have extinction. So let's just say we're looking at the same sized island like we have in this example here. We're looking at the same sized islands, but they're at different distances from the source of species. So if we just overlay the extinction line on here, the extinction line is going to be at equilibrium uh, for the near islands at this point. So it'll have that equilibrium number of species for the near islands. But for the ones that are far away, the distance islands, it crosses that line at this point, and it'll have a much lower equilibrium number of species. And then the one that is the intermediate distance, it crosses here and has an intermediate number of species for its equilibrium. So you can see how you would get lower numbers of species if you're more distant because it's being affected by where that immigration line is crossing the extinction line. So you could have lower immigration, whereas your closer islands are going to have much higher numbers of species. So this is a much nicer example of this. We can see the rate of immigration on islands is going to depend on how near or far they are from sources of species. And this really does show you that fragmentation of habitat would increase isolation, anything that's going to increase isolation. So if you increase fragmentation, you remove habitats, make it harder to get from one place to another, you increase isolation, then that's going to have an impact on how many species are getting into your island, to your park, to your natural area that you're protecting. And then we can counter this. We just put a extinction rate here. So this would be the rate of local extinction. And so local extinction for the near island results in this equilibrium number of species, but the more isolated island results in this number of species. And even though we have the number of species at those points where they cross is stable, so you keep a stable equilibrium, but you also you have immigration going on. It's just equal to the rate of local extinctions. So you still have new species coming in and old species going extinct. Now let's think about this in terms of what would happen if something occurred and a whole bunch of new species appeared onto my island. So let me just take one of these islands. I'll deal with the near one, the top line. And let's imagine that something happened and instead of being at equilibrium, people moved in and they brought a whole bunch of things with them. Rats came with them, cats, all sorts of new things arrived with them. And so now our number of species is higher than the equilibrium number for that island. So, or it could have been a storm blowing in new individuals. Now, if we're at this high number of species, if we look at the equilibrium or the immigration rate, it's much lower than the extinction rate. So you're having a lot more species going locally extinct every year than you have new immigrants coming in at this point. And if that happens, then your number of species is going to drop until immigration equals extinction. So if I'm to the right of that point, I know extinction is greater than immigration and the number of species will decline. Well, let's say the opposite occurs. Let's say a hurricane happens and the number of species drops down to a lower number than the equilibrium, And at this low number, my immigration rate is much higher than my extinction rate for this one island. And so if immigration is greater than extinction, then I'm going to have my number of species increase until we get to the point where they're equal. We know that immigration is going to be affected by isolation, and it might also be affected by the size of the island. Obviously, if you have a bigger island, you have a bigger target. So you might have higher immigration on large islands as well. Um, But area also has an impact on extinction rates as well. So if we look once again at the species richness and the number of species per year that are going, this time we're going to talk about extinction, local extinction of species. And we know that the bigger islands will probably have more resources than the smaller islands. So if we look at the extinction rates of a big island, they're going to be much lower than that of a small island. So I can put the extinction rates of a big island right here, and that would be a large one, versus the extinction rates of a small island, they would be much higher. And as you have more species, they both go up. So they're both going to increase with the number of competitors using up the resources in the area and competing for the resources. So this would be a small island. And then you would have the large island. So let's just say the small island and the large island are still the same distance from the mainland. So if I look at my input of species, so I have my immigration rate going like this. So immigration is blue. And where we see the two lines cross for the large island, we have an equilibrium number of species right here. So that is the number of species you would have at equilibrium for a large island. And then when we see the two lines cross for the small island, your equilibrium right here for a small island is going to be lower. So you can see how this is going to impact area is going to impact the extinction rates, and that's also going to impact your equilibrium number of species. At the same time, if we look at a more distant isolated island that has a low immigration rate, so this island is far and this island is close. The immigration rates, you could see if you're a small island and far away, so small island and far away, your equilibrium number of species is going to be, this would be that small far versus small close versus large close. Your equilibrium number is going to be the lowest if you're the smallest island far away. So you have low immigration and low or high extinction rates. Once again, remember that these points, the actual species composition is changing because you have some new species coming in and existing species going locally extinct. And we can see these close small islands, they have the highest immigration rates and they have the highest extinction rates because they're small. And so you're going to find very high rates of species turnover. So species turnover is really indicating that you're getting a change in the species composition over time. So you've got new species coming in and other species that were already there going locally extinct. Whereas some of these other islands are going to have much lower turnover rates, like the small Far Island. It's not getting a lot of new immigrants, and it's not getting a large number of extinctions, so it has much lower rates of species turnover because of the fact that it is so limited in both of those factors. There are two different primary factors then controlling the species richness. As the islands are bigger, as the area increases, the number of species will increase. And as the distance decreases, as you are closer to your source of species, then you're going to get more immigrants, you're going to get more species. So as you get more distant away, the number of species decreases. So this distant small island will have the fewest species, and this closer, larger island is going to have a lot more species. And so this distance and area are both impacting the number of species on the island. So you have all the pieces of the puzzle now. We have the general theory on the left here, where you can see that the immigration rate and extinction rates are going to balance each other out at some point, so that you have an equilibrium number of species where those lines cross. But the shapes of those curves are going to depend on the size of the island. And so we can see that we expect the extinction rates to be higher on smaller islands. So that line is going to be higher. And we also expect immigration rates to be higher on far islands because on large islands, because you've got a bigger target size. But the small islands is a small target size, so the immigration rates are going to be lower. So if you have low extinction rate or high extinction rates and low immigration rates, you're going to have a much lower number of species on small distance islands and a much larger number of species on large close on small islands, and more species on large islands, which we find. But at the same time, we've also got to look at how isolated the islands are, the effective distance from the mainland, and we know that if you're further away, you're going to have fewer immigrants. You're also probably going to have higher extinction rates, because if your population is getting low, you don't get it replenished as often. So your extinction rates are probably higher on those further islands as well. And so you're going to have the further islands having smaller numbers of species than your islands that are close to your source of species. So I know there's a lot here. So really the take-home message is that the equilibrium model of island biogeography predicts that the number of species on an island is going to be determined by the balance of species immigration and extinction. And it's also going to see that your number of species is influenced by how isolated your island is and how big the island is, because both of those things are going to affect your immigration and extinction rates. And so this particular graph is pulling in those effects of isolation on immigration and the effects of extinction, of island size on extinction, to look at some different scenarios. Now, if we have the equation for one of these immigration lines, so let's just say I'm looking at this immigration line here, and if I have the equation for this line, and if I have the equation for this extinction line. So I know they're both dependent on, at the equilibrium number, they're both dependent on the number of species that are already on the island. So when I know that I'm at equilibrium, the immigration equation will equal the extinction equation, and I can solve for the number of species then. So if I have those two equations, I can actually solve for the equilibrium number of species. And we know it's a stable equilibrium because if I end up having more than that number of species over here, extinction is higher than extinction is higher than immigration, and my species number is going to go back to the equilibrium. The same thing if I'm at a number of species where I'm below the equilibrium, it's going to increase because the immigration rate is higher than the extinction rate. And we can determine what this is if we get the equations for those two lines. So we'll be doing an island biogeography lab where you're going to be able to calculate the immigration rate lines and the extinction line, and you'll be able to determine the equilibrium number of species for different islands. At this point, I think you'd be able to fill in this graph now. If you have the number of species, the species richness across the x-axis, and you have the rates of immigration and local extinction on an island, you would be able to draw the immigration line for a mainland, island near the mainland or an island far from the mainland, and you could also draw the extinction line for small islands and large islands. So you should be able to do this now. We know that the equilibrium theory of island biogeography predicts this number of species on each island dependent on its isolation and its size, but it also notes that this number of species, the composition is going to be changing constantly, which is called species turnover, because you have new immigrants and you have species existing on the islands that are going locally extinct. Well, is that really happening? So, because we think things are fairly stable. So, Jared Diamond actually looked at this on the California Channel Islands, and he compared the number or the actual species composition on different islands that were surveyed in 1968 to a survey that was done 50 years earlier. And he was able to see that even though the number of species for most of the islands stayed fairly constant, you could see that they had several species go locally extinct. So the orange bars are the number of extinctions, local extinctions. And so we can see 5 species disappeared off of Santa Cruz Island, but then you also had 5 species or 6 species appearing as new immigrants in that 51-year period on Santa Cruz Island. So we can see sometimes the uh, some of the islands were not exactly even in their immigration extinctions. Some of them were very even. So overall, we can definitely see that there is a species turnover in the composition of the islands. Around the same time that Jared Diamond was looking at the species turnover in the California Channel Islands, Dan Simberloff, who was a student of E.O. Wilson, decided to do, as his PhD thesis, a test of this immigration extinction process. And what they did was they took mangrove islands off the coast of the Florida Keys, and he had 2 of them he left alone, and then he had 6 others that he actually went and fumigated with insecticide in order to kill all the insects. And then he looked at the immigration of new species onto those islands, and he got to the point where you had a constant number of species on the islands, but you constantly have composition changing. So species of insects on the islands, some would disappear and new ones would come. So he had significant evidence that this process was working on these small mangrove islands. Here's some of the data from the Simberloff and Wilson experiment on the mangroves, and they found that on the islands that they did not take any uh, insects away from, they sort of kept their number of species constant, but they had species come and go. And then here we can see two islands data for we're looking at the year after they had fumigated them, and we can see that the one that was near the mainland or closer to the mainland ended up getting back to its number of species pretty closely. So we have its original number of species on that island before they fumigated it, and it actually surpassed that. So all the species came back and then went back down to that number. So you can see you had higher species richness in the equilibrium and then went back to the equilibrium. The one that was further away, you didn't get it back. It didn't quite make it back to its equilibrium number in this period of time. So clearly it was harder for species to immigrate to that. But even though they were getting to these numbers, the species composition was changing. They did have species turnover. In this experiment, Simberloff actually cut the islands up to reduce the island size to look at the area effect. Sometimes when you think about bigger areas, you think, well, a bigger area is going to have more habitats. That's why it would be able to support more species. But if he takes a mangrove island and just cut it into smaller pieces, so cut off some of the mangrove trees, you've still got exactly the same habitat, and you're just changing the area available to the insects. And as you can see on his data, as he cut the mangroves from larger sizes to smaller sizes, we can see that the number of species, the species richness, reduced as the island area went down. And here he did this once on this one and still got substantial increase. Didn't cut it twice. It just kind of stayed the second time. When he did the second cuts, he didn't change this one, and it just stayed at the number it was at. The controls that he didn't change, we can see actually in this time period increased in number of species. So we can see the area effect is pretty prominent on the equilibrium number of species. This is an interesting study where they were using data from the 1800s when a lake they dropped the level of the lake in Sweden, and they inventoried the number of plant species on 40 different islands, and then they went back periodically over the next 100 years and continued to look at the number of species. And so you can see the black line on each of these is the number of species on each island or on the various islands. And so we've clustered this data into small, medium, and large sized islands over the 100 years. They put these graphs on top of one another in the textbook. I like to line them up side by side because you can see the scales match up. And that we can see that on the small islands, the number of species have continued to increase over time, and we can see increases in immigrations of new species over time, but we can also see that there are local extinctions, so you're getting species turnover. The medium islands, we get the same thing. We have the number of species increasing over time, and then we seem to have this fairly constant level of immigrations and extinctions going on. So it's getting close to an equilibrium. And the large islands, they seem to have quickly got a lot of species on them, and then they've started to drop off, which means there's probably competition going on, and we can see these extinctions going on. We also see the extinction and the immigration lines are crossing one another here. So we have the extinction line is going up, the immigration line is going down, so you may have an equilibrium number of species. The y-axis on this is the number of species that has gotten cut off, but if you look at where those lines cross, then you can probably get an idea as to what the species turnover is, because you've got about 30 new species coming on over the 100-year period, and you've got the same number of extinctions happening at that time. When you think about biogeography applied to habitat islands on continents and the issues with fragmenting those habitats, making them more isolated, it's obviously very applicable to conservation science and has been used in conservation biology extensively and in planning and designing systems of nature reserves. So think about how it applies on habitat islands on continents, and also why do islands start with fewer than predicted species at small areas compared with continents? So think about some of the issues with being on an island as opposed to being in an extensive continental system. Just scaling this up at this point to sort of from islands to looking at continental scales, species area relationships, you think maybe these uh, dynamics between immigration and extinction are just as important whether we're dealing with a large spatial scale or a small spatial scale. We do see that species area relationship holds for the continental areas. This is looking at the diversity in different sizes of tropical rainforests on different continents. The green dots are plant diversity, and then the purple dots are the number of fruit-eating uh, vertebrates, so that we can see that obviously the bigger areas have more species, but this can also be related to not just immigration and extinction and competition for resources, but could also be changes in the diversity of those habitats. So there's a lot of other factors other than just immigration and extinction that might be important for understanding this species area relationship. For those in my class, make sure that you can answer the concept review question number 1 for the first section 22.1 and all the 3 questions for 22.2, the on biogeography section, and then the chapter review questions 1, 2, 5, and 6. Also, go back to the end of the book in Appendix A, Investigating the Evidence number 22. It's looking again at sample size and really how do you deal with sample sizes when you're dealing with very large areas? We've only got so much space, and so looking at sample size again and some of the issues working on large spatial scales. So hopefully you now have a good understanding of island biogeography theory and its relationship to species area curves and diversity.